So the power of empathy will be your superpower in working with students. That's my first thing is, trying to understand. I think we love to fix things. I don't have all the answers. I can't just, I don't have any magic policy, stop. This is going to take a community to, but if we can think about the struggles and how hard this is, and then kind of work backwards from there of what can we do? And I'm in no way advocating that money solves everything. I mean, yes, there's a lot of stories I could tell you, and money will do a lot. But so many of the people that I met and the situations that I had are really about like wraparound services and being supportive throughout. So we can't think about transitions and then forget, sort of how hard it gets after that. That's incredibly important.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I am your host, Heather Shea. Today, we are diving into the second part of our two-part conversation with Dr. Ann Hornak, a professor of higher education at Central Michigan University. If you haven't watched part one, we recommend you go back and listen to that before starting part two. If you watched part one, you know that Anne took on a very unique sabbatical project last year where she worked full-time while taking a full load of classes at a community college to see if, like Barbara Einreich in Nickel and Dimed, she would be able to make it all work. Anne's study uncovered many components of the unique challenges facing financially strapped college students. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of students on my campus and also students on your campus and maybe differently served through some of the resources. But if we think about all the college students at community colleges, 2-year, 4-year liberal, right? Then you start thinking the scope of this need is so great. And that's where I think your study is really fascinating in terms of the takeaways that we as higher education administrators who do student success work need to have a better understanding of all of the complexities of students' lives. It's not just come to campus, go to school, go home anymore. It's rare that students are having that experience. I think what you're describing is much more typical. So I'm really interested in, we talk a lot in student affairs about challenge and support, right? And it sounds like some of the biggest supports you were both able to receive as well as give were through this workplace environment, not necessarily through the campus environment. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about like what else could the campus have done to support, and maybe it's about this kind of like sense of belonging, community component. But I think your experience is probably really typical of students who just, nobody knows my name. I'm going to just kind of remain anonymous. Yeah. So, yeah.
So the beauty of where I worked and where I went to school was the same community. So many of my coworkers they weren't my classmates, but they were the same institution. So I always think like there's a reason you do things and maybe you don't even think about them. But because I am pretty well versed, having been a student affairs, practitioner, educator, administrator, and now, teaching in a higher ed program I'm aware of not all the resources, but a lot of them. And because I also live in the community, there were times when I served as like, did you know? Or, I would just hear a conversation and, I could say, did you know that, like, I bet your institution has a writing center, or I bet your institution has a math help room, or, just some kind of general. But bigger than that was I was also able to say, that there's a whole wing of like student success coaches, academic advisors, and
Mhm.
that will help you like navigate and do all of this stuff. Because paying for classes, I think also we know that transfers really challenging. And I think we're extra challenged in the state of Michigan because we're like the Wild West of,
Yeah. Higher
education.
ed.
So
Yeah.
for those of you listening, like we're not a system state, so there's no guarantee. We have affiliation and articulation agreements with institutions,
Mhm.
but it's not set up like one for one in all cases. So working with an advisor is essential to not overtake or undertake, like kind of
Yeah.
utilize both. And I would one time I heard students talking about, oh, I went and picked up, the guide and it said, whatever institution on the top of it. So it should work for, this major and for me to transfer, even though I maybe don't want to go to X institution. And I was like, okay, I'm just totally eavesdropping. This is how I said, I'm totally eavesdropping on you, but you might want to actually, I said, because the requirements at, Eastern Michigan University could be really different than Western Michigan University or Central Michigan University. And I happen to know that the institution they were looking at doesn't have that program. So I
Yeah.
thought, you can't, and it was a little bit like I wasn't trying to be like, oh, all knowing and stuff. But it was so I think there were times when some of my coworkers were like, wait, how do you know that?
Yeah.
Um, I felt like, okay, I was meant to like be standing here eavesdropping at this moment and maybe to save somebody like a ton of heartache of, oh my gosh, I took all these classes and this isn't. But we haven't made that easy for
No.
students. And I don't know, I mean, I've never worked in a system state to
Mhm.
know that, but I know that the legislation and the way that system states are set up it is much more seamless than it is in this state.
Mhm.
And we have to do a better job for that. It creates a better pipeline too for ease and of transfer students, both in the state, out of the state, across institutions.
Yeah.
Um, I just, as 50% of our students start at community colleges, 50% of our undergraduate or high school graduates, we're not talking about a few students here. We're talking about the majority of our students.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a book that I read while I was in the doctoral program here called College Unbound by Jeff Salingo. And he talks about, kind of like we have this perception that a student finishes high school, immediately starts in college, does that full time for 4 years and then leaves. But like unbundling like degree programs, credentials, making transfer processes easier, demystifying the funding, and the book was just, it's fascinating. I mean, who is the editor of the Chronicle? But as you were speaking about some of the like the meta issues that I think higher education in the US at least, I mean, this is the other thing is this is very US specific. In other countries, it is really interesting how educational systems maybe work better or differently for working students, people who are going back and getting a degree. But I've been thinking a lot about like that, what if we had to remake the systems, right? And create a different way for people to get what they need to be, learn, thrive, and graduate from our institutions. Like what would that look like, and how would we design higher ed differently, right? And that your study kind of makes me kind of go to that like high level question.
Right. Well, and I think we always think, oh, if we just had like free community college or 2 years free, like this would all sort of go away. And I think it's bigger than that because it's not just about paying for school, it's also life. And
Mhm.
so many of the individuals that I met along the way are in this cycle of low income work. So it's like most, when I would hear them talk about their families and where they came from and what people do in their lives is it wasn't, my dad's an orthopedic surgeon and my mom's a, university professor. It was, my dad's a mechanic and, or I'm from a single parent home or, custodial work, lots of multi-generational people working at the restaurant. And I mean, this restaurant, and I would say this probably about corporate restaurants because I kind of learned this they're good to their people. They create I would definitely go back there. I mean, the management was really good. The company's a good company. I mean, it's corporate America, but you happen to be doing, blue collar work there. So that was definitely like you can see that cycle of like parents working with their kids at this restaurant.
Mm.
And where do we break that cycle? So if we were to do it all over again, like I think free education doesn't get the job done. Like we have to think about other ways. I one of my biggest things was tips. So
Yeah.
tips, we've confused the whole tipping process in this
Yes.
country. So
Yes.
when I told people that I make $3.93 an hour, like people would like fall over and say, "What?" I said, "I know." I had a little bit of shock. I'm like, "Wow." And I started January of 2024 when it went up. So that was like a raise. I don't know what it was before that,
Yeah,
but
like 215 or something. I don't know. I don't know exactly,
oh,
but yeah,
bad.
super
And
low.
so, but when you go to no other place, so
Mm-mm.
everywhere else, and I don't want to like call out like companies and stuff, but we see tip jars everywhere now.
Yeah.
And those individuals are making at least minimum wage. I get minimum wage is not a living wage, but they're not dependent on their tip to make minimum wage like tipped workers are. So when you go to a restaurant or somewhere where you're sitting down and someone's serving you, and you're like, oh, my service wasn't very good. I'm only going to tip this person like 10%. You're just taking away money. Like you're not proving any point. Like I never walked away and thought, oh gosh, I could have done better at that table. I mean, there's lots of times I could have done better at a table, but
Hmm.
when I was punished for that, it just made me kind of salty. And I thought, wow, you have no idea. Like now I can't buy those, I can't buy the diapers I need, or I can't buy the impact is so much greater than just like telling someone like you stunk. Like I mean, so we really have to think about that. Like this relationship with, and other countries have just gone away from it
Right.
because it pay people a living wage and be done with it. And then it's not a game of, it's just not a game anymore. And I like our relationship with the tipping culture is just,
Hmm.
it's really tenuous and
Hmm.
it's so impactful. In some of the things that restaurants, not specific to the one I worked at, but in general do is like these competitive things about, drink sales and um, time to get food in the computer, like the time it takes, because everything's like tracked from an iPad to when they walk in the door to sit down, the food and the thing. The servers that have the least amount of time will get the most hours. So they're also doing that to sort of incentivize, and I think it's actually a backfire, and it's hurting our college student workers the most because I also work with high school students.
Sure.
Who most of them, like honestly, were awesome, but were there like for fun. That was like
Yeah.
fun money, especially in the community that I happen to be in.
Yeah.
And if they had enough money, like made enough tips for probably gas and whatever else they needed, I don't know what their home lives were
Yeah.
like, but they would call in like lots on Thursdays and Fridays
Uh,
because and the managers knew that. They're like, oh, this is when the high school students start to call in because they have enough money. Like if they happen to work some other days, which whatever, I don't judge that. It was a benefit to the college students because then they could pick up those shifts. So there's just a really interesting like
mm,
phenomenon around that too, which I thought that's just kind of fascinating to me. But there's other like kind of really consequential things that did hurt individuals and their ability to, get ahead or, get what they needed to pay for what they needed. That I think, corporate America sort of thinks. this is good for my bottom line, but doesn't think about the worker at all. I definitely learned those too.
Yeah, I mean labor, just in the ways in which labor is constructed and and also compensated. Your point about other countries is really interesting. I don't know if I told you this in previous times, but I lead an undergrad study abroad, and when we go to Europe, the students are often like, "Oh my gosh, the service is so slow. It's so terrible." Whatever their judgment is, right? I'm like, it's because they are not rushing you out the door because they're going to get paid whether you're there for 30 minutes or 3 hours the same, and that they're not expected to tip comes at this benefit, but there's also this like critique, right? And so
And
I was thinking,
expectation. Yeah.
yeah, and an
Yeah.
expectation, right? And so I have kind of unpacked that as far as like how do we value work, and what is work in the United States, and do you realize when you go into a restaurant that turning over the table is really important. So when you're friends and you go there and just have water and you're
Right.
occupying that space, you're taking the tip, potentially
Yeah.
like the person's not going to get paid the same for that time period that you're there.
I did have a table that stayed for 5 hours once.
Oh my
My
God.
entire time I was there, but they also tipped me like $50 for like I think they had like coffee and desserts or I don't know. It was two friends that haven't seen each other in like 20 years. It was the coolest story ever.
Yeah.
And they were lovely. And I felt like so I when I got kind of good at what I was doing,
Yeah.
over sort of like over probably bug people. And they kept saying, like, you don't have to come back here anymore. We'll still give you a good tip. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I'm that like annoying person. You have to find a balance with,
Yeah.
yeah, because I in Asia too, same thing. Like there's no tipping culture. You can
Yeah.
take a table for 5 hours and like nobody's gonna rush you out and they're gonna, you can just kind of hang out. Plus the pace of like life is like,
Yeah.
you know, sharing bread, breaking bread is,
Yeah.
that's a like cultural, like really important. And here we're like eat really fast
Eat
and
really fast. And then we wonder why there's, issues with, fast food and eating, all of the different other health impacts as well. I'm
Mhm.
really, I'm really interested. And we've talked about kind of the bigger picture level. We've talked about the like institutions and the work environment, but what did you learn about yourself through this process? And this might be a good point to mention your blog because I'm sure people who are interested might be really like your blog is really fantastic at describing kind of the day to day. So I'd love to hear more about what you learned about yourself and then how you kind of documented that reflection.
Yeah, I like when I think about this, I think of like what were the ways that so I learned that I have so much privilege in my life.
Mm,
I really had to sort of check that every day, especially
mhm,
every day that I went to work. Classes, I think you just get in the pattern of it. Um, when I went to work, I had to really kind of check myself at the door and
mm,
um, like so I think of myself as a pretty kind, like pretty patient person. I learned that that's not the world. Like that's not probably most of the people that I worked with, that I interacted with. There's lots of people that just have so much going on in their lives, and like I started thinking of them as like rude because
mm,
they didn't want to like chit chat and talk and stuff. And I thought that's really biased on my part. Like I have no idea what's going on in this person's life, and you know, I'm here I'm here because I'm doing something, but I don't next week I don't have to be here. I always really thought about that. And I don't want to say like, oh, I'm a kind of a judgmental person, but I mean I think I knew this, but the role of class in our society
yeah,
is so huge.
yeah,
So huge. Just navigating, even being a good server, like language and talking to people. And restaurants get we know this. If I was able to disclose a restaurant, people would be like, ah, I get it. I mean, it was not a high end, think of a kind of a middle of the road restaurant. Um, it gets a whole swath of people that, come there, regulars, whatever. So I realized that I I was like kind of I got really good at sort of relating with people in their sort of place, the customers. There were people that I never connected with working. And I don't, I work really hard to try to understand people just because I'm fascinated by people. I love people. I love community. I felt such a kinship with so I had to kind of take a step back and say, this isn't about me. It's not something you're doing. It's something you're not doing. The work is just hard, like trying to understand and empathize with someone whose life, I said this earlier, but that is such hard work. I mean, it is backbreaking, exhausting. And then, like at the end of the night, you have to sweep and move tables and you're just exhausted and dirty and hot and, feel gross and want nothing, your ticket out is, finishing up this like side work and stuff. And um, but not doing it puts that labor on someone else, like someone either the next morning or the custodial staff, like to have to stay longer. So I was really, really thoughtful about that. But I also watched people not do it and just like leave and be allowed to do that. So even the way kind of we set up sort of exit strategies in the restaurant world are really interesting. But I always had to take a step back and, kind of temper that and not it wasn't my role to police that and um, kind of be all knowing. I also learned that I have lots of really good ideas, and I had to like really be thoughtful about like why. I mean, I always wanted to understand the why we do the things the way we do. I did have a little bit of an opportunity in one of my exit interviews to one of the people asked me like, are there other ways that you would do this? And one of the things I'll just tell you, so when people leave, the servers like leave for the evening, they always, there's about a half an hour or so. Like I get out at 5:30, someone else gets out at 6, 6:30, whatever. They do that, super intentionally, and then we whittle down to like one or two people that are closing. And the closing people do get a little extra money. They do. I did it once and I was like, I don't ever want to do this again. There's like so many things to remember. And there's no list. So when I closed the one night, I said I have to have like, what if I forget to like turn the coffee pot off and like burn the place down or
Yeah.
this? I mean, I was just so worried about like these safety things.
Yeah.
So I stayed the night before and wrote every single thing down that you do. So that in the morning, like the night shift didn't get yelled at for, not doing something. And you never know when the health people will come. I'll tell you this, there's some health people coming, the health police. So that now we had this list. I offered to type it up. We typed it up, we laminated it, and we have this like nice, closing
Closing
list.
checklist. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a contribution, but I
Yeah.
worked hard not to be that person,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. We
not
can
to be
make them
this,
better.
yeah,
Innovation. Yeah.
yeah, systems person, because there's
Yeah.
also lots of things that worked really nicely. But the one thing I never understood because it's such a power differential was whoever's the checker, that's like the closer person,
Mhm.
would check other people out. So they would check my tables, like to make sure they're clean, make sure, like there's ADA stuff with like salt and pepper shakers and sugar
Mhm.
packets and counting and stuff like that for, visually impaired. Um, there's other like things specifically with the restaurant that, when you walk into a chain restaurant, it should look the same at every
Yeah.
chain restaurant.
Yeah.
So, some people were really good about checking and doing that. Other people were, I think, a little intimidated. Like I was older than them, or so and so was older than them, or been there longer. Like the power differential. And I mean, I get it was power, like, with a small p. But, I told them, I said, that's like really hard for people. I could easily say to someone, like I did that, and not, or I'm not gonna do that, or I mean, it would just, it creates, it's sort of, we do this in residence life sometimes of moving
Yeah.
people around, and now you're supervising with no conversation, and some of those dual relationships like don't work, and so that was one. I felt like kind of a big, like I needed to check myself on that, but I also like when I was invited to share some of these things,
Mhm.
so the privilege of like having a little bit of experience and education
Mhm.
was kind of something I learned about myself, and then a big one was, and I'll just kind of name this, is I got to navigate college. I worked all through college, but my dad stepped on a landmine in Vietnam, and he's alive. But so for a long time, he was the only 100% disabled. Lost an eye and kind of has some Swiss cheese stuff going on from the landmine. But he was also the 100% employed. So I went to college on the GI Bill. Now, navigating that was a whole different story, but I also didn't pay for college. And I think of like, I thought about that probably almost every single day when I listened to the stories of some of my coworkers. And I didn't talk to my classmates, so, but I'm guessing there's like some very similar sorts of intersections there. That was, I just learned just class is huge. And I just think we have to kind of constantly be introspective about our own privilege and what that means and how to leverage that. Um, sometimes I think I did a good job with that. I failed in other parts and probably looked like a know-it-all. But I worked really hard at that, and learning that about myself, was huge. And, it's for everything that, days that I think are really hard it's nothing compared to the stress of, you know, not knowing, will I be able to continue in this program? Will I, like it just, that's kind of overwhelming to me. I know we can't take on those, but when you know people really well and you can't, I never meant to be a savior, but just understanding that now is
Yeah.
just huge to me. And I feel incredibly lucky and privileged to just know that, because I feel like I can use some of my privilege to help some of my students just by understanding that and
Yeah.
knowing that and maybe sharing the stories, even in an incognito sort of way.
Mhm. I'm thinking also about, I know you're a parent, right? Like I'm also a parent. I have a college student, but I'm also thinking about like how do we also share these lessons with, our partners or our children and others who we maybe have a more direct influence on, even if they're not the ones who are living that experience. But and this isn't even in our like questions, but I'm really curious what your kids and your partner thought about all of this process, like, and how you talked about it. Like, were you able to reflect and have kind of processing questions um,
Mhm.
with them?
Yeah. So my kids, so I have a 20 time and a 20-year-old. So they're 24 and 21 now. And my daughter is graduated, and working, she's in an MBA program, but works full time too. And lives out in Arizona. So, and my son is studying abroad in Mexico this semester. So, yes, they were along through the whole journey. My partner came in probably once a week, and would die. And then my son came in twice. One time, this is so funny. He says, Mom, the guy asked for a Coke. Take the guy a Coke. And I'm like, oh my. And I'm like, oh, my tables are all set. I can like stand here and chat for a couple of minutes. Yeah. That was so funny. Yeah. So he was like taking care of me. And yeah, it was really funny. I'm like, oh my gosh, the Coke.
That's,
Um,
that's
they, they were on board. They thought it was like kind of the coolest thing ever. It was probably,
yeah.
I was like the coolest mom ever for, 16 weeks. But we talked a lot about um the privilege they have of not being strapped by student loan debt, like the things that they can do. So my daughter went out to Arizona to do an internship. She ended up staying. But there's no way she could have done that just if we said just go. Like, she needed seed money, she needed rent money. I mean, she got paid, but it takes what, a month to get paid in a new job.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, I definitely try to keep that in the fore for them.
Mhm.
That this isn't like your experiences are, unique experiences.
Mhm.
I grew up incredibly working class, so I feel like that's always my roots. I was never not for anything though. We always had food on the table and,
Mhm.
um, clothes on our back and, college was always, both my parents have an education, but they were not in education as teachers. So there wasn't, they definitely lived paycheck to paycheck for a very long time with three kids. Um, but I think the power of education, my kids like kind of understand that now, but it's also an immense privilege and holds a lot of responsibility. Um, yeah, the cool factor is still my favorite.
That's great. That is great. Um, Final kind of wrap up question. I'd love to hear kind of what lessons or insights would you want folks, whether they're administrators, student affairs educators, graduate students, people who typically listen to our podcast, what would you like them to learn from this experience? We talked a little bit about practices and policies that would be better supportive to students who are financially strapped and who are balancing school and work. But if you could encapsulate like what is the biggest takeaway that you would want folks who are listening to this episode kind of think about as they're processing?
Mhm. So the power of empathy will be your superpower in working with students. That's my first thing is, trying to understand. I think we love to fix things. I don't have all the answers. I can't just, I don't have any magic policy, stop. This is going to take a community but if we can think about the struggles and how hard this is, and then kind of work backwards from there of what can we do? And I'm in no way advocating that money solves everything. I mean, yes, there's a lot of stories I could tell you, and money will do a lot, but so many of the people that I met and the situations that I had are really about like wraparound services and being supportive throughout. So we can't think about transitions and then forget, sort of how hard it gets after that. That's incredibly important. We need to do a better job on our college campuses of talking to each other
Yeah.
across our campus, especially when I was at Michigan State for a very long time. We do so much siloed work and so much good
Sure.
work that's
Yeah.
siloed. And the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing sometimes. And, like I said before, these are the students that are going to get lost
Mhm.
because they don't rise to the top of some report or, and we have to figure that out. Like we have to figure out, short of going to every restaurant and, I'm joking, but
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
to figure out, like, I don't want to profile, but, how do we capture these students that are really on the financial edge? They're on the financial cliff. Um, and a lot of them are going to walk away with a huge investment with nothing to show. And that is, I mean, that's already a huge problem in our society is, h- how do we recapture, but how do we keep these students and support them in ways that's meaningful? Not a monolithic group at all. They're so unique, but there's got to be some ways that we can resource them. And capture them in our resources so they don't get lost and fall through the cracks.
Yeah. And this has been such a fabulous conversation today. I'd love to hear your typically we always end every episode with what are you thinking about, troubling, concerned about now? Maybe you want to answer that. And if folks can get in touch with you, what's the best way? And definitely your blog will post in our show notes.
Yeah, and I'll put my email too, so
Okay,
anybody.
perfect.
Um, what I wish I could do this longer. I wish I
Yeah.
could. I wish I could. So I would, if I did this again, I would have a research partner. I would have someone who's living this, like as
Yeah.
my, sort of like a duo ethnography and like
Yeah.
walk along and like, we talk about walking in people's shoes. I sort of walked in my own shoes in a, kind of way, but like actually having a co-researcher to, collaborate with, I think would be pretty awesome. So if someone else wants to do that study, please. Um, that's one. I never went into this thinking I wanted to write a book. I could never do what Barbara did.
Mm.
But one of the things I found is, um, I think w- there's so many individuals in higher education that know this. Like, we get this.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, it's not new. I want to talk to chemistry faculty, to engineering faculty, to
Mm.
people outside of our student affairs higher ed bubble, business faculty. Like academics don't like I think are starting to kind of understand who's in their classes, but this is again, I mean, we all have these invisible identities that are really impactful in being a financially strapped student is definitely an identity. I mean, we don't have hats, we don't have buttons, we don't, they sit in our classes and are probably, have a life experience stressed out. Yeah. So I want to talk to faculty. I want to just keep talking to people. And of course, I'm doing, the stuff that I have to do um, post sabbatical in terms of research. But I think there's powers in just the story. So I feel so incredibly lucky that I was able to share my story in this.
Yeah. Well, and this could be forwarded out, right? Like if you're listening today, think of 5 faculty on your campus that should hear this, right? And
Share
let's
the blog.
share
Yes.
it. Yeah.
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 Yeah, there's also like funny stories in there, and I think like you would have so much next time you walk into a restaurant, which is probably shared among lots of people listening,
Yeah.
you'll just have a really different perspective of who's helping you.
Yes.
Maybe more empathy and care and kindness, which, goes a long way too.
Yeah. And particularly if they're a college student, right? I mean, I think
Yes.
that's a whole nother layer.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much. I learned so much and I really appreciate you bringing this idea and I can't wait to release this episode. It's going to be, I think, the book will be, an amazing resource for folks too. We'll probably link nickel and dimed in our show notes as well. But I think this brings it home to the way that we do our work and how we can better support students. So thank you so much, Anne. Um,
Yeah.
I also just want to take a moment, as we always do, to express our gratitude to Nat Ambrosi, our incredible producer. Nat's efforts behind the scenes do not go unnoticed, and we are so thankful for all the work she does. And to all of our listeners who are tuning in today and haven't already subscribed to our weekly newsletter, you can take a moment to enter your email address on our website at studentaffairsnow.com. We release episodes every week on Wednesdays, and we always release a newsletter every week on Wednesdays. So you'll know first which new episodes are out. And while you're on our website, you can visit our archives. We have over 220, 230 episodes at this point. And if you're listening and can leave a review or forward this to a friend, that also helps too. Once again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks to everybody who's watching and listening. Let's make it a great week.